Republican Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore and his supporters are fighting back after a bombshell report from the Washington Post alleging sexual misconduct. One woman told the paper Moore touched her sexually back in 1979 when she was just 14 years old. 3 other accusers claimed that he made sexual advances on them when they were 16 and 18 years old. He was in his 30s. The report included 30 sources, but Moore denies the allegations, calling them fake news. And last night, former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, a Moore supporter, also blamed the media for reporting the woman's stories.
But it's interesting. The Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped that dime on Donald Trump is the same Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped the dime this afternoon on Judge Roy Moore. Now, is that a coincidence? That's what I mean when I say opposition party, right? It's purely part of the apparatus of the Democratic Party. They don't make any bones about it. By the way, I don't mind it. I'll call them out every day. It's not a fair and free media anymore.
Well, when asked about the allegations, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, quote, "The president believes that we cannot allow a mere allegation, in this case, one from many years ago, to destroy a person's life. However, the president also believes that if these allegations are true, Judge Moore will do the right thing and step aside." Multiple Republican senators had a similar response.
If the revelation, if that's true, I don't believe there'd be any place for him in the U.S. Senate.
No. If there's any shred of truth, he ought to step aside.
He should step aside if the allegations are true.
The allegations, if true, to me, mean he needs to step aside.
But former presidential nominee Mitt Romney had a different response, tweeting today, "Innocent until proven guilty is for criminal convictions, not elections. I believe Lee Corfman, her account is too serious to ignore. Moore is unfit for office and should step aside." Domenico Montanaro is the lead editor of politics for NPR. He joins us now. Domenico, thanks for joining us. You know, we heard these multiple senators say that Moore should step aside, and they use the word "if" these allegations are true. Romney said that they should just step aside regardless. Why aren't more Republicans taking that route?
I think that is one of the tougher things for a lot of people generally to take. Usually what you hear in a lot of these political scandals is if these allegations are true, it's even kind of far for them to have to say that they should step aside. You normally don't hear that. You hear people saying, well, let's see how an investigation plays out. So for Romney to take that position is certainly far more progressive than you're used to hearing almost anybody talk about these kinds of issues and whether or not someone should step aside. I want to make one point also about Steve Bannon and his comment that, you know, the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos are somehow, you know, in cahoots to sort of take out Republicans when the Access Hollywood tape was true. I mean, it's not that Donald Trump denied that he bragged about groping women. You know, that was actually a true tape that came out. So if this allegation is true, is Bannon saying that that's not something that the public is entitled to know? And certainly, you know, voters in Alabama would feel that they have the right to know. You go ahead.
Dom, I want to ask you about those voters in Alabama. I mean, is there a sense that this resonates with them, that with the Access Hollywood tape, many people were surprised at how some people thought the president got a pass, and some of his core voters, it didn't really matter to them. They still voted for him. Is that the case in Alabama? Is there a way to gauge that?
Well, yes, and actually they've been you've seen a lot of reporters talking to people in Alabama, and especially consultants in Alabama, who are basically saying no one gives a blank what Mitch McConnell or John McCain think. That was one quote, actually, from a consultant who said that nobody cares in Alabama what John McCain, Mitch McConnell, the Republican establishment think about this race, and that what was going to be more important was you know, how voters in the state felt, and that they're trying to say with a month to go in this race that this stuff is made up, because this is a huge race for 2018. You know, this is not just an Alabama race or about just the Republican Party, because this race, if the Democrat in this race, Doug Jones, who's actually a pretty good candidate within striking distance of Roy Moore in this race, if he's able to pull off this upset, that opens the door for Democrats to be able to have a pathway to possibly take back the Senate in 2018. It's a narrow one, but if Democrats Democrats are able to take back Arizona and Nevada, then that suddenly 51-49 is a lot easier to do than 52-48 where it stands currently. That, of course, assumes that Democrats hold all the other targets, and they're certainly facing a difficult map next year.
You talk about the math with Democrats. What about Republicans? Let's say Moore does step aside. How can they hold on to that Senate seat?
They probably can't if Moore steps aside, because they can't actually get somebody else on the ballot. It would almost in a de facto way go to the Democrat, unless someone like Luther Strange, who was the person who lost in the primary to Roy Moore, runs an independent candidacy, as Lisa Murkowski, the independent senator from Alaska, former Republican, now Republican again, encouraged him to do. And remember, she won a write-in race against a Republican after losing her primary, which is a near impossibility, but because of her name ID, she was able to pull it off.
You know, Domenico, the White House called this a mere allegation. That's a direct quote. But with all of these recent headlines on sexual harassment and assault everywhere, Harvey Weinstein out, Kevin Spacey out, are lawmakers in Washington not being held to that same standard?
Well, I think that you're going to hear a lot more about sexual harassment and Capitol Hill, for example. We've had some reporting on that, and there's going to be some hearings next week about sexual harassment. And there's certainly lots of women who are reporters who've had lots of stories, and lots of staffers who've had lots of stories. You know, it's certainly hit every industry that we can think of. It's hit our industry. Certainly at my network, at NPR News, our head of news was ousted recently because of allegations of sexual harassment that were confirmed. So this is touching every industry, undoubtedly, and will definitely hit politics as well. Yeah, you're certainly right about it touching just about every industry. Meanwhile, I want to turn to President Trump's trip to Asia. He's in Vietnam for the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, or as they call it, APEC, and he shook hands with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The White House said there were no sideline meetings scheduled between the two leaders. What do you make of the optics of that, though? Well, they said that there were no formal meetings that were going to be scheduled throughout this entire trip, when there had been some indication that there was going to be a formal meeting. You know, President Trump and Vladimir Putin certainly were expected to at least say hello to each other, most likely, given that they were in the same space. But this APEC conference, it's quite fascinating that you've got President Trump going there and really taking a completely different tone than most past American presidents about free trade, about, he calls America First policies, his very protectionist policies of his, when APEC was basically founded in conjunction with the United States to try to bring Asia into, especially Southeast Asia, into the sphere with the United States when they're trying to lower prices back home for Americans. President Trump, in a way, takes a tack that maybe a Bernie Sanders would take in saying that, you know, jobs in the United States have been lost because of players like China and other places in the Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, for example. So we're seeing a major political and economic shift away from what had been this Asia pivot that President Obama and other presidents had tried. I want to play a bit of sound for you from the president's speech overnight.
The current trade imbalance is not acceptable. I do not blame China or any other country, of which there are many, for taking advantage of the United States on trade. If their representatives are able to get away with it, they are just doing their jobs. I wish previous administrations in my country saw what was happening and did something about it.
How unusual is that to sort of throw former presidents of your own country under the bus and the international stage?
Well, it's certainly unusual, but it's not, you know, surprising when it comes to Donald Trump. He's been talking about President Obama and his policies, and marked really most of his early presidency with trying to uproot and change a lot of President Obama's policies. Now, President Obama and other presidents like George W. Bush would argue that they did try to do something about it, to try to blunt the force of the growing economic force, rather, that China was becoming by creating the Trans-Pacific Partnership and linking those 11 Asian countries with the United States to have this trade deal that was not with China. So it was meant to undermine China, and now President Trump essentially elevating President Xi in China, as President Xi was the person, by the way, not coincidentally, the person to close out that conference in the speeches made there. Certainly the bigger figure in the Chinese realm, in the Asian realm now, is China.
Domenico Montanaro, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.